So welcome everybody to plenary panel number 2, and this is called Approaches to Translation and Transmission. So Western scholars of Buddhism in Tibet have come late to the field of comparative literature and translation theory, despite the wealth of insight Tibetan scholars have to offer on the topic. I think this panel will surely reveal how fruitful that exchange can be. So let me introduce Luis Gomez. It's an honor for me to facilitate a panel with Luis Gomez as a speaker. I had the privilege of studying with Luis at Michigan in the Buddhist Studies program that he created, which continues to be a testament to the breadth and excellence of his knowledge and research interests. Luis doesn't only work with multiple source languages, but with multiple target languages, translating into both English and Spanish. He can remind us that it is not enough to know Tibetan. One has to know the target language as well. Jonathan Gold, Associate Professor of Religion at Princeton University, has been writing about issues of translation and transmission for many years, particularly as pertaining to the works of Sakya Pandita, a translator and philosopher who has a great deal to offer on the topic. We are fortunate that Jonathan joins the panel in order to present a Tibetan view of translation theory. As he will explain for us, Sapan was deeply concerned about the authority of the translated text, anxious that the words on the page were not sufficient to carry the transmission. Susan Bassnett has already given us a brilliant exposition on the translator paradox. We are fortunate to have Professor Bassnett with us again to speak this afternoon on the question of whether there are things that cannot be translated.
Sorry. Lowering the tone.
David Bellos is Professor of French and Italian and Comparative Literature and Director of the Program in Translation and Intercultural Communication at Princeton University. He's a translator, biographer, and the author of a wonderful book about the art and folly of translation. Is that a fish in your ear? Professor Bellos spoke so wonderfully in 2014 about how many particularly vexing decision points for the translator reflect just choices and demands made 2,500 years ago. Among these was the issue of adaptation. Translators making choices to preserve or erase the origin language. I'm glad he's come back to talk more about these xenisms and how to think about them. So we'll start with Luis, and Luis is going to speak a little bit longer than the other panelists, and then we'll continue with the same format we had this morning. And I remind you, please write your questions down. And again, Dominique will collect them, pass them to me, and if you want them read, I'm happy to do that. You can indicate that on the card, and I'll remind you again once the presentations are made to please send us questions.
You want me over there or over here?
Wherever you're comfortable.
I'm more comfortable there because I can read.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I want to read. I never quite read, but I will come close to it. I also, well, maybe I don't have to announce it or make any warnings because I think you can hear me well.
Yeah.
Because I have, for different reasons, my voice is not projecting the way it used to. I also want to point out, in case it was not clear, I'm not a Tibetologist. You know, anytime that you do too many things, you don't do anyone well, okay? But one that I do more or less well is more the job of the Indologist and the philologist. And my interest in translation theory came much later, just like my interest in history of religions and the academic study of religions came much later. I started as a traditional philologist. I wanted to read Buddhist texts so that I could know what they really meant. You can see what that can do to a potential translator, right? But I think we all start there somehow. Anyway, to translate, it seems one must be willing to exercise the restraint and discipline of systematic unoriginality. In one of Montesquieu's Persian letters, a geometer chides a translator of the Latin classics who congratulates himself on the completion of a new translation of Horace after 20 years of hard work. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Je viens de donner mon Horace au public, he says. What, says the geometer, 20 years spent without thinking for yourself? The mathematician concludes triumphantly, you speak for others and others do all the thinking for you. There's some merit in making Horace available to the public in a new and updated version, and the geometer does not deny the value of this accomplishment. He says, I value as much as anyone else the sublime geniuses that you dress up. Can you guess the French for dress up? Okay. Like drag queen dress up. But you will never be like them, because if you are constantly translating, you will never be translated. In one of his last contributions to the problem of biblical translation, Henri Mechonique uses this particular passage in the Persian letters, it's Persian letter 128, for further reflections on translating the Old Testament, which was his forte, by the way. I will not attempt to debate today the fine points in Mechonique's paper, or the question of the originality or lack thereof of the translator. That's not my main interest. Yet I must side with the geometer. As usual with mathematicians, he has his facts as right as he could have them. But still something is missing. Is the discipline of not being original really a zero-sum game in which the author is all creativity or the translator a slave of a presumably well-defined original that makes the translator unoriginal? The issue has been debated in translation theory for years, and the answer is clearly somewhere between the philologist translator and the geometer of our story. An essay by André Lefebvre, which I will quote with trepidation because he was a longtime collaborator of Susan Bassnett, so I may actually say things that either are not correct or maybe Susan or André changed their way of thinking. But anyway, in a paper with a very suggestive title of Why We Waste Our Times on Rewrites, you can imagine where that goes, at least partly. That paper somehow I took to be an echo of what Mechonique is doing with Montesquieu. Needless to say, it's completely anachronistic because Lefebvre actually wrote before Mechonique wrote his paper. But the paper by Lefebvre was published in a collection of essays, which one of them by Suzanne Bassnett, with also a very suggestive title, The Manipulation of Literature, Studies in Literary Translation. And that gives you an idea of where that goes, okay? I'm not going to focus on manipulation, but I will definitely focus on adoption and appropriation, which is, of course, one of the great functions of translation. That the translator deals in working on and peddling rewrites should be obvious by now. But there's no reason to lament this fact. Is there, after all, any writing and reading which is not in some ways trying to sell used wares? As Lefebvre makes clear in his contribution to Herman's volume, this is the nature of critical reading generally, or, as I was stated, this is the nature of our desire to preserve works that we value and are wanting to make these works accessible to those we believe might or should want to understand. To present and transmit a work we consider worth transmitting, we will need to rewrite it in some way. We do not want the deceptively perfect copy of El Quijote in Pierre Menard, autor del Quijote, as oppositely characterized in Borges' fictional piece. There is nothing inherently problematic in the reprocessing that is writing, rewriting, reading, and translation, in what Anton Popovich has called literary meta-communication. We don't have time to go into detail, but you can get an idea of what he means when you think about literature as a meta-communication, having many dimensions which are not the straightforward, obvious communication that we think is being presented in a work. In a few words, it is a characterization of the polysystem's reworking of a literary piece in its many roles within a network of cultural production. Among these communicative functions, we must include what Bruno Osimo, if anyone knows him here, you deserve a prize, you'll get an A+. He was the Italian translator of Popovich. I have to read the Italian. I can't read Popovich in the original. And he calls it la comunicazione traduttiva. Okay, so the translator's communication, or the communication that is translation, and the discursive and the manipulative universes involved in the production of a translation, all of which are always there and unavoidable. In Lefebvre's paper, referenced above, what Popovich sees as multiple acts of communication, transformation, and meta-communication, which includes, by the way, as a matter of parentheses, the marketing of the book is part of the translation process. Those of you who have published a translation probably know that. That's a fact, okay? Appears as a set of constraints and control systems, which includes, this is more or less paraphrasing Lefebvre, includes ideology, poetics, patronage in the cultural spheres, or the spheres of discourse in which the work is produced, transmitted, and received. In speaking of translations, however, we should not forget other control systems, in other words, other ways of constraining the originality of the translation produced. Lefebvre also speaks of the code and the poetics and the canonization of the output. He also speaks of the constraints of the natural languages involved as further controls. In talking about the task of the translator of Buddhist texts, these controls take on peculiar expressions. That doesn't mean that translating Buddhist texts is so special that nobody else can talk about it except me, right? It really means that the particular way in which a translation has to operate in a cultural sphere for Buddhist studies has peculiar characteristics. For instance, natural languages may include more than one form of Asian linguistic universe. It's very rare that one can work on a Buddhist text without considering multiple languages. Even if you're working on an autochthonous Chinese or Tibetan or Japanese text, you do have to take into account that the people who wrote this, even if they didn't know the Indian languages, were thinking they knew them or were thinking they were using them. So if you want problems of translating what can't be translated, you can start right there. Those of us who seek to understand and carry on the transmission of Buddhist ideas, practices, and texts in Asia, and I underline that, ideas, practices, and texts, in Asia or in the West, because I think most of us do it in both areas. It's unavoidable. We cannot avoid working with reworks, with rewrites that are called translations. Even those who are not translators rely on both texts and forms of discourse, which, even when they are not themselves translations, show in the very manner in which they construct or transmit meaning traces of their origins in a world of translated text. And this has been true in Asia as well as in the West. The phenomenon is a prime example of what cultural theorists, such as Evan Zohar, have called polysystems approach. And we don't have to go into Evan Zohar, we just can imagine all the different cultural systems and different modes of transmission and reception that are involved in simply reading, let's not talk about translation, simply reading a Buddhist text. These different forms of cultural communication also, of course, include various genres and will include various languages. I will not distract you by delving deeper into the implications of these conceptions of translation theory, which have been around actually for more than 30 years, so I'm in some ways rehashing things that have been said before. Rather, I'll take a few minutes to share with you some of my personal experiences of what it means to work in between cultural worlds in a system of meaning and transmission that is a polysystem. It includes many levels of communication, and what it means to want to understand and enjoy the distortion or the refraction that is to follow the rays of light across and through the multiple prisms that form cultural transmission and communication. And there I'm playing on a trope of Lefebvre in one of his essays. Very interesting paper on Mother Courage's pickles, okay? It might be useful to reflect quickly on some of the prisms through which the light of Buddhist texts reaches us. And for that, I will use some of my experiences, not recently, but in the last 10 years or so. In translating Buddhist texts, we obviously negotiate or renegotiate, argue, and polemicize a family of discourses that try to be both specialized and inspirational. The characterization is evidently oxymoronic, a fixed set of technical equivalents that seek to make claims regarding their inspirational force. And very much that striving to get the technical meaning right is, of course, somehow constrained by the audiences to which we address our translations. I will not say that it is absurd. It is really an aporia. It's sort of an impossible task that has to be carried out nonetheless. But I will not say it's absurd because in the end we do not want to find that middle ground that is translation, where we can pretend not to be original at all, while we want our translation to be innovative enough to awaken a new or special understanding. This is one of the several reasons why I don't use the consecrated phrase, Buddhist term, but rather speak of transmitting forms of discourse, words, phrases, sentences, collocations, forms that are potentially dynamic and protean. In other words, even when they can stand for a technical notion or concept, they can take many other forms, and you have to watch for those. Before considering several examples, let us remember that translation is not the lonely act of rendering one word into another, but a social communication act. And let me speak about some of my experiences with that social communication act. Okay. Some years ago, time flies, so I don't want to say a few years ago. I think it's a little bit more than a few years ago. I was asked by Don Lopez to provide some translations for the Norton Anthology of World Religions, which came out just a year ago, 2 years ago, more or less. Some of these pieces I'd been working on for some time. But the interesting thing is, apart from my own experience with some of these texts in more than one version, Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, etc., what made it even more interesting was that he asked me to lend, you always lend, you don't give, my translations on texts that I was already working on, but also on two texts that I was also translating into Spanish at the same time. And that was, for me, quite an experience. And actually, it's what started me interested in translation theory, because to translate a text, Pali, one of the examples I want to mention, into Spanish, and at the same time, because I was already planning to give this to a publisher, and at the same time, Polish and English translation makes it obvious to you that the Spanish and the English are two different texts, and yet that they are not two different texts. You can take that home as your homework. Okay. So also, one of the texts that he asked me to contribute to is a text preserved in Tibetan, the original Sanskrit of which is lost, but which forms a group with two other texts, the Bhavanakramas or Kamalashila. The second Bhavanakrama is preserved only in Tibetan. That doesn't mean you can read it straight as if it were Tibetan, because it is part of a group of three where many passages are actually duplicated. So are you going to read those passages according to what you know about the Sanskrit, or are you going to read them according to what you know about the Tibetan, or is there a third strategy? I think there's a third one, but nonetheless. So this one presented yet another problem in terms of what it means to translate into more than one language. In that case, it was not me who did it, but somebody else did it. He also asked me to contribute something from the Bodhicharyavatara, which I was then already almost ready to publish in Spanish. It's already out from Madrid many years ago. But anyway, what this reminds us is how complex is the network formed by the range of choices you have as a philologist and the demands of the people who want you to publish whatever you're doing, okay? Norton Anthology, but also published in Madrid, it changes significantly. And I'll have something to say that in a few minutes. At any rate, one of the things that makes interesting the reading of these texts is that they present, and as a translator, you have to accept the fact that they present problems that we have to characterize as philological. And yet they're also presenting problems that you have to characterize as not quite philological, but in a completely different category. For instance, if I translate into English the word vipassana, and I'm going to get into trouble with a lot of people here, but I'm happy to do so. If I'm going to translate it into the word insight, at the same time that I realize that in Spanish there's no word for insight, okay, then I have two choices: to do what my students do, which makes me very angry, which is to say, we don't have words for Buddhist terms like insight in Spanish. You get an idea what that means in terms of translating? Yeah, we don't have the right English word for vipassana. So, personally, I think that's not the best translation. But the Spanish makes it obvious that you can't go that way because you don't have that word. Also, another one of my pet peeves, mindfulness, which is not a translation of Sanskriti, if you ask me. And lo and behold, thanks to the Renaissance mystics of Spain, we have an old Spanish expression, which makes it clear that it is not about mindfulness, but about presence, particular kind of presence. And I've seen some English translators who go that way. Anyway, that's the way I go in Spanish. So you can see the multiple layers of significance, of meaning, of philological analysis that crisscross with the multiple layers of your audience and also of the people who are asking you for the publication, right? So in the end, in the English translation of the Bhavanakramas, I gave in and put insight, despite my reservations, okay? I thought it's the only way it's going to be understood by the English readers. It's already there, okay? So you have multiple contexts, and then on top of that, you have something more that I want to speak in a little bit of detail, and I'll try to simplify it because this is where it gets more into philology and how philology tells you something about what is not philology. In other words, about, well, it is philology. The way in which words never mean one thing, okay? Words are seldom monosemic. They're usually polysemic. I can think of a few monosemic words like appendectomy. But yeah. But then you could also say, my boyfriend feels like an appendectomy to me, right? Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden it has a different meaning, right? But most words don't have to be metaphorically stretched. They naturally are kind of elastic, okay? Which is good. Otherwise, we can translate something noted already by Schleiermacher many years ago, the plasticity of meaning and interpretation. So I will pick now 3 words, and I'll try to make it quick, but somehow condensate it, from the Bodhicharyavatara, which are polysemic. And the reason I chose these words is because I've been working on them on a project we have in Berkeley at the Mangalam Research Centers. And I've been working on the variations in use of these 3 words in the Bodhicharyavatara and the variations in the meaning of the word, okay? It's the same, I mean, there's 3 words, and it's the same word, number 1, number 2, the same word, number 3, same word. But the number of meanings, and instances, and contexts are so varied, so I'll make it quick. The easiest one is the more concrete one, the word amsha in Sanskrit. It's in Tibetan it's che, a piece of something or a fragment of something. And in Sanskrit, it has meanings ranging from something that is accumulated, something that is apportioned, something that is gained, inheritance, and atom. Of course, a piece of something is an atom, right? So there you have all of those meanings with the word amsha. In the text itself, this is what is called an arbitrary limited corpus. These days, you don't do translation unless you have a real corpus. I was actually right here next door last year at a conference where we discussed the use of corpus for translation. But this is a very limited corpus, just one work, and yet, in such a limited text, you have a word that occurs 12 times in 7 different contexts, and I can identify at least 3 meanings. One is part or portion. The other one is atom. You think about it, an atom is a portion of something, unless you're taking physics 101, in which case will be different. But also inheritance. And I will not go into the details, but there's a particular passage where it means inheritance. And only an old-fashioned, discredited translator got it right. Bendel, one of the first translators of the Bodhicharyavatara. He realized it has to mean inheritance, because it is the portion that you receive from the Buddha. He's talking about the Buddha's inheritance. In other words, what you inherit from the Buddha by the mere fact of being a sentient being. It's a beautiful passage. I recommend it highly. Okay. This one, by the way, in 2 places is still preserved in the Dunhuan version, which is interesting because the others are not. The second word is the word Tsadra, which you all know. And says, oh, Tsadra, we all know what that is. It's a Buddha field, right? No. In this case, we have 6 instances in 5 contexts, and only one of them means Buddha field. The others are all in a different semantic field. If you take Buddha field as domain being the semantic field, which I think is the easiest way to do it, the Buddha field is a domain that a Buddha somehow presides over. But the other meaning, the more common one, is field, but in a sense, not Buddha field. I'm translating Vimalakirti with Paul Harrison, and he just gets really angry when I say Buddha field. It's not a Buddha field. Okay, Buddha domain, Paul. I'm happy with that. But field in the sense of a plot of land. Which is not exactly what a Buddha field is when you think about it. People don't work over there. They don't plant anything in the Buddha field. So in this case, it can be a place where you plant anything, good or bad. And you might say, yeah, so what's interesting about that? It's very interesting from the point of view of translation and lexicology, because it means that it's a word that can have a neutral semantic rhetoric. In other words, it can be either positive or negative depending on the collocation or the context. And that's interesting, because again, it tells you Chitra doesn't mean just one thing. So if it's the field of merit, it's a good soil where I plant good things and I want them to grow. If it's the field of anger, which is another one of the instances, then it's negatively loaded. Then the last word is one that you will probably be more interested because we tend to, and I must confess that I also tend to look for the meaty, right, doctrinal content, right? And then we forget the importance of portion. What kind of portion, right? The last word is citta, okay? Citta occurs 122 times. And on top of that, occurs in synonyms like manas, cettas, etc., 11 times, okay? Now you say, well, surely citta has only one meaning, right? Well, it doesn't. This is something that has been observed before, and in this case, I made a short exploration into the larger corpus of Sanskrit, and it became very clear that citta can mean so many things, but the favorite home for citta is will, not mind, okay? The idea of mind, some kind of brain or whatever, is more will. And I'll just quote one short line from Shishupalavada. It says, Prabhu chittam evahi jano nuvartate. So the people indeed rely only on the will, or follow only the will of the king. Prabhu chitta has to be the will, because anuvartate, they follow it, right? This is very clear. This is one of the uses that we find in the Bodhicharyavatara. In this case, and I picked this one in particular because of that, in this case, there's a whole tradition about how to translate citta. and a whole war going out there that sort of calms down for a few years and comes back. Many years ago, Giuseppe Tucci had a translator translate into Italian his Religions of Tibet. I don't know how many of you realize that he didn't write it in Italian. He wrote it in English. And in the Italian version, Le Religioni del Tibet, he complains about the fact that he was forced to use mind for citta or sem. It's absurd. And I can tell you it's absurd, he says, because in Italian it doesn't make any sense to talk about this as mente, right? Like in Spanish it's the same thing, right? And I'm going to give you an example that I think clinches it in Spanish, but you will get there. But anyway, he complains about it. So I look at citta in different places. I already told you the total number, and I will just concentrate on two uses of citta that show that it's not mind as a sense of organ, but something more that includes will, emotion, etc. And that's the problem. That's why we can count that as an untranslatable. Well, I have to hear what Susan has to say about that. But so the word citta, for instance, in the first chapters, the first 4 chapters, definitely is nothing but bodhicitta. Nothing but that. So citta, even by itself, it means bodhicitta. As you move into 4, and then 5 and 6, it's no longer bodhicitta. It is, for lack of a better way of putting it, the kinds of attitudes, preconditions, states of mind that are necessary to cultivate the bodhicitta. So it is that, the bodhicitta in the technical sense, right? Now, I will not go into the details of this, but notice that what this is suggesting is that as you go through the Bodhicharyavatara, you're going to have to translate certain words in more than one way. And there are different ways of doing it, different strategies that you can follow. It's not the end of the world. Okay? But anyway, this is really not a shift in the word itself, but it simply expressed the full semantic range of the word. And this is extremely important. I find much more interesting the occurrence of citta in another place, which shows not a shift, but simply a particular point in the semantic range. These are passages where citta is declined. We all learn to translate by declining first, right? Big mistake. You don't learn by declining. But anyway, it's the vocative. And the interesting thing about the use of the vocative is that you have parallels in which manas, cettas, hrudaya are also used in the vocative in a similar way. These are passages in which Shantideva says, oh, my citta. No, he doesn't even say my citta. He says, oh, citta, in vocative, oh, citta, oh, manas, right? Imagine if you said in English, why have I sinned so much? Mind, why did you do it? And imagine how that would feel as an elegant, artistic translation, right? But we're in a pickle because it's not easy to find a good way to translate it. In Spanish, I translated it, and I've been excoriated for this. So if you frown or whatever, or boo, that's fine. Spanish, I translated these expressions as alma mia, okay? I have had English speakers, Spanish speakers, and German speakers excoriate me for that. But the truth is that in vernacular Spanish, there's no other way to say that. You couldn't even say corazón mío because that's a romantic tinge that we don't want there. Right? Well, we definitely don't want to say mente mía. What? What? You know? Especially if you're talking about sinning, right? Committing terrible crimes. Anyway, just as a counter argument, so you can calm down and go home and think a little bit more about alma mia, let me quote as a sort of short sidetrack part of a poem by Edward Friedrich Mörike, famous German poet, in which he talks about the evanescence of life. It's a beautiful poem. And he says, think about this. Right now, they are planting flowers that will adorn your coffin. So this is anicca, isn't it? Great poem. And this particular stanza says, Sie sind erlesen schon. Denkes, o Seele, ja? Auf deinen Grab zu wurzeln und zu wachsen. So they're already being collected to be planted at your grave. But notice how it says, think about it. And he doesn't say, think about it, my mind. Think about it, my brain. No, he says, think about it, my soul. Because in the context of German, in which he was writing, that's the way you would say it, right? Okay. Well, this is a good example, I think, of the constraints that certain canonized concepts can have on us. We feel like it's impossible to translate citta because we already know what it means, right? And it has one meaning. So I would like to close by saying you're right, by giving you examples where it does have one meaning. Right? That's what makes it really difficult, right? If it did not have these particular contexts, then it would be no problem. We could say, oh, you know, those Buddhists, practicing Buddhists, they don't know what they're talking. It's the same thing they're doing with insight and mindfulness. They don't know the original words. But no, this time people say it has to be a particular meaning, have a point. Because one of its favorite collocations is bodhicitta, especially bodhicittotpada. And the Chinese, the Japanese, the Tibetans, they all agree on translating with what is essentially a calque. And in English, the calque is, go ask Paul Harrison, don't blame me, okay? Go ask Paul Harrison. He thinks it's disgusting. This is the production of the thought of enlightenment, right? I don't think it's disgusting. I think it's meaningless. We don't produce thoughts in English. I mean, maybe we do somewhere in here, but in English, we don't produce thoughts. We have them, right? And in this case, it's not the thought, but rather the aspiration. So it is having the aspiration, just like that. You don't have to follow the Sanskrit grammar. And yet, tradition agrees that it should be a single term. And then we are having problems, because then we were going to have to translate citta in bodhicittotpada in a particular way, and citta in all the other meanings that I mentioned in a different way. And that is quite a challenge. If we add to this a term that occurs in the Tibetan of the two of the Bhavanakramas and occurs in one of the Sanskrit Bhavanakramas, Paramartha bodhicitta, then there too it's very specific kind of bodhicitta. Okay? So there you have to think, is it going to be thought, is it going to be attitude, etc. All of these things that we see in some of the translations. We therefore have a word and many of its collocations sandwiched in between multiple usage, selective specialized usage, and special metaphoric usage. The latter may be characterized as a family of attitudes and states of mind associated or clustered around an act of will, such as aspiration, the aspiration towards do something, like awakening, and also, as its meaning moves into other chapters, the requisite and the resulting states of mind that characterize this aspiration. Okay? It's very important that the word is polysemic and that it slides in meaning this way. Shantideva did not make it up. It's built into the word, very much like in the expression paramartha bodhicitta. The word there is part of the natural meaning of it, okay? Because then, in that particular case, it's a state of mind. The word citta then represents a family of attitudes and states of mind which essentially have ambivalent or bivalent semantic prosody. It can go negative, positive, it can slide into very concrete meanings and also into very abstract meanings. The above gleaning, quick as it is, from several encounters with Indic Buddhist texts, should show to what extent being constrained by a source language and the cultural controls of transmission in no way makes the unoriginality of translation less problematic and less creative, and in no way makes it less necessary. In other words, the art of being unoriginal is part of the task of translation. Any other attempt to appropriate to adopt or adapt, and to share a set of readings with a given community of readings would not work. We do have to somehow sacrifice the originality of the author by looking at the multiple meanings, and this is where you have room for your originality, by the way. You have plenty of room, so don't despair. The multiple meanings, the semantic ranges, and the semantic prosodies that a single word could have in any one of your texts. Thank you.